All right. Hi, everyone. How's everybody doing this morning? Very good. Yeah, tired. Likewise. So, oh, not bad, just sleepy. Hey, who saw the lunar eclipse on Tuesday night? Did anyone catch that? Yeah. It was still kind of neat. It was just a partial eclipse though. It's not as impressive as a total lunar eclipse. Yeah. But I missed the Northern Lights the other night. So, partial lunar eclipse. That's cool. Yeah, Philippe used the telescope. I wish I had a telescope. I was standing there with my camera, or rather my partner's big DSLR camera. I'm trying to work out the camera settings to take the photograph so that it turns out okay without a tripod. I think I pulled it off, but um, yeah, total lunar eclipse is neat because you get that blood moon kind of thing. Well, that's cool. It's always important to look up at the interesting celestial phenomena that are happening around us. So here, I'll share my screen and we'll get going with today's material, which is, well, I suppose what we have to do first is finish off last week's last lecture's material. So just let's do a little bit of recap. We were talking about the two primary traditions with respect to knowledge in philosophy, rationalism and empiricism. So, rationalism, of course, has it that knowledge comes from the intellect or the use of the intellect, and empiricism has it that knowledge comes from sense experience. We used a priori knowledge to see just how these two traditions differ from one another. And the picture we ended up with was something like the following. For rationalists, um, you can have knowledge of at least some universal truths, um, or I should say, some universal truths can be known a priori. Um, and of course, some rationalists are a little more hardcore than others, right? I mean, Plato, who believed that there were perfect forms of everything from tables and cups to justice and the good, uh, thought that you could know about these things by grasping uh, the nature of the forms, right? And to an extent, for Plato, knowledge is innate. Knowledge of the forms for Plato is innate because Plato, I don't think I went into this last time, but Plato actually believes in this theory of like transmigration of the soul. So we die, our souls in some way encounter the pure forms, and then we're born with knowledge of the forms, but we forget it because of the trauma of birth. So we have to recollect this knowledge. So not only can we know things a priori, we kind of already know things innately, at least when it comes to the forms. Descartes thought that you could work out certain metaphysical truths um, a priori, as it were, such as his cogito, right? He can know that he exists with certainty, with infallibility, um, just by exercising his intellect, by working through these skeptical arguments in his head, right? Empiricists think that, sure, some knowledge is a priori, but this is just like linguistic or conceptual knowledge. So, you know, all triangles have three sides, or all Joeys are baby marsupials. Um, these don't actually tell you anything about the world. Rather, what they tell you about are the relations between words or concepts or ideas, right? And then we left off on Kant, um, who kind of shakes things up a little bit, right? He wants to do a Copernican revolution in metaphysics, where just like Copernicus couldn't make sense of the planetary motions by leaving the Earth at rest and having everything revolve around the Earth. Instead, he had the Earth revolve. Here, Kant said, "Well, look, let's see if well, I'll read you here, right? This would be like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolved around the observer, tried to see if he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and left the stars at rest. Now, in metaphysics, we can try in a similar way regarding the intuition of objects. Instead of having the objects conform to our cognition, maybe our cognition uh, can conform uh, to the objects. So, what Kant means is that the mind structures our experience of the world in such a way that it presents events in the world to us causally. And that's how Kant is able to formulate a synthetic a priori proposition like all events have a cause. This is not an analytic proposition. Okay, the predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept, but it can be known a priori because that's just how the mind is structured. It's structured so that things appear to us causally, right? And this is, of course, his famous transcendental idealism. Now we're going to talk about Quine and Kripke for a little bit before we move on to the next set of slides. But before we do, does anyone have any questions about anything I covered in the recap, or anything that I might have missed? Any questions about rationalism, empiricism, a priori knowledge, or Kant's Copernican revolution? Okay, looks like there are no questions, which is either because everybody understands it or because we're sleepy. But I don't know. Maybe we'll encounter some more questions as we go. So, Quine, WVO Quine, and the two dogmas of empiricism. So remember, if you're an empiricist, analytic propositions, the propositions or sentences about the world whose predicate concepts are contained in the subject concepts, provide a priori knowledge. That's the only a priori knowledge we can have because it's definitional. It's conceptual, right? It's to do with the meanings of the words or the concepts that we're employing. So it's only that these truths that we know from language that are a priori, and everything we know via the senses is a posteriori. And empirical knowledge is reflected in synthetic propositions by and large. This is not true for Kant, but it's true for empiricists like Hume, for example, or A.J. Ayer. Now, Quine, in the early 20th century, or early to mid 20th century, wrote a very famous paper entitled Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And the first dogma has to do with what we're talking about today. The first dogma is that we can distinguish between synthetic and analytic propositions in the first place. In other words, it's a sort of it's dogma, it's orthodoxy. It just is the case, right? That we can distinguish between analytic and synthetic propositions. What is a dogma? Let's talk about that. Well, this is a word that we usually hear in like a religious context, right? Like it's the official, I guess, in sort of informal vernacular, we could say it's the official story, right? It's a certain set of beliefs that you have to have. Um, we can't distinguish. Um, well, so empiricists and rationalists think we can easily distinguish between analytic and synthetic propositions, but Quine is going to say we can't. So yeah, dogma would be like, um, let's say that you're, let's say that you're going to join a religion, right? And I think dogma is something we hear about mostly within the context of Christianity. So it's like, let's say you're going to go and become a Catholic, right? Well, there are certain things you have to believe. You have to believe that you have to believe in the Holy Trinity and the Immaculate Conception, and you have to believe in um, original sin, all of those tenets, right? Those are the dogma. So Quine is saying that the idea that we can easily distinguish between um, analytic propositions and synthetic propositions is like a dogma of empiricist philosophy. That we can easily tell the difference between a sentence that's um, about the relations between concepts or about the world, that we can't easily make that distinction. So yeah, Quine is trying to undermine this dogma. We'll look at the second dogma later in the course, but he tries to argue that we cannot make this distinction, right? And he starts by having us consider analytic sentences. What are they like? Well, analytic propositions are synonymous. They have this feature called synonymy. So let's do the triangle example, right? All triangles have three sides. That's an analytic proposition. And we see that the word triangle and three-sided polygon in this case, so triangles are three-sided polygons, they are synonymous one another. They mean the same thing. And sentences that contain these synonymous expressions are the same sentences that contain necessary truths. They are necessarily true. A triangle is necessarily a three-sided polygon. If you're not a three-sided polygon, you're not a triangle. And if you're not a triangle, you're not a three-sided polygon, right? Just imagine, if you can, a three-sided polygon that's not a triangle. We can't really do it, can we? Right? It's necessarily true that any triangle is a three-sided polygon and vice versa. So we've moved from analytic. We're like, what does analytic mean, and what makes it different um, from synthetic? Um, we move from analytic. So analytic statements are the ones that are true by definition. They're true by definition because they contain synonymous expressions, and synonymous expressions are necessarily true. Now, which sentences are the necessarily true ones? The analytic propositions. And now we've come full circle. So a synthetic proposition is a proposition whose subject concept is not contained, or predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept. So the example we used last time was the pants are purple, right? Um, it's not it doesn't it's not necessarily the case that the pants are purple. You have to go and look and see what color the pants are, because there's nothing in the concept of pants um, that implies that they must necessarily be purple. They could be any color. And you want to know what color they are, you have to go and look at the pants, right? Or think of a sentence like, the cat is on the mat, right? Is the cat really on the mat? Well, you have to go and look. Um, because there's nothing necessary about cats that implies that they are always on the mat, right? Okay. Can I can I explain why this is circular? Well, Quine's argument is not circular, but he's trying to show us that there's a circularity in the way that we understand what analytic sentences are. So we've got analytic sentences, which empiricists say express conceptual truths, truths about the relations between concepts, like all bachelors are unmarried men, right? That's just definitionally true, or uh, necessarily true. If you're a bachelor, you've got to be an unmarried man. Otherwise, you're not a bachelor, right? So these are the analytic ones, the analytic sentences, and they are synonymous because bachelor and unmarried man are the same thing. So they contain this synonymy. And these synonymous sentences are the necessarily true sentences. And the necessarily true sentences are the analytic sentences. So we've gone in a circle from analytic to synonymy to necessity and back to analytic. So it's our definition for what an analytic statement is circular, is what Quine is arguing. And that's not good because that means that we don't really have an understanding of analytic. And he argues that if we can't have an understanding of analytic, then we can't really have an understanding of what it means for a proposition to be synthetic either. And that's what this argument boils down to ultimately is that there's not available to us a good understanding of the analytic synthetic distinction. Everybody following so far? Okay, good. It sounds, a lot of this sounds tricky because there's a lot of big words, but when you think about it, when you think it through a little bit, it's not that tricky, right? It's not that tricky. Anyway, one of the consequences that Quine is worried about is that we can deny any analytic proposition if we make compensatory conceptual changes. So if I say all triangles have three sides, somebody could deny that by just altering their concepts of what triangles are. Now that's kind of a controversial claim, right? Like what am I going to do? Just decide like nope, triangles have four sides now and everyone else is wrong. Like what? um so this has proven to be a little bit controversial, right? Um because I don't know, can I do that? Can I just say, well, bachelors now include married men as well? I have decided to make that conceptual change. Like, what? I mean, that sounds a bit absurd. Maybe I'm being uncharitable. Um, but we could make changes to certain of our concepts, perhaps, and deny, some ostensibly analytic propositions that are maybe a little bit less straightforward than the triangles and the bachelors and the vixens and the et cetera, et cetera. Kaya says, I didn't understand too much until I finished chapter two. It feels like being told that the rainbow exists, but only learning one color at a time. And now, yeah, that's how this goes. That's a good way of putting it. It's like you're getting you're getting little pieces of the puzzle here and there, and it takes a while to put them together. But once you do put them together and you can stand back and see the picture, or stand back and look at the rainbow as you've got all the colors, as you say, then it's, that's when you have those aha moments. So, yeah, it all sounds tricky, but if you stick with it, uh, you see that it's not as tricky as it seems, right? So yeah, this is a bit controversial. Paul Grice and Peter Strawson think that the analytic synthetic distinction is still useful, even if the boundaries between the two types of propositions are a little fuzzy. There's still some utility in making this distinction. Like, sure, maybe we can grant that Quine is right and that there's some circularity in terms of how we understand how we define analytic propositions. But there still seems to be some kind of um, general sort of resemblance between propositions like all triangles are three-sided polygons and all joeys are baby marsupials. And there's a different sort of similarity between statements like um, the pants are purple and the car is parked outside or something, right? Yeah, complicated rainbow. All right, so we'll look at the second dogma of empiricism um, later, which is probably the more controversial of the two. So, all right, Kripke. So Kripke is a difficult, another difficult. Who, well, his work is can be a little tricky. So we're not going to cover too much of what he has to say today. Suffice to say, okay, we know that rationalists and empiricists agree that anything that we can know a priori, anything that we can know independently of sense experience must necessarily be true. But back in the 1970s, Kripke argued that some a posteriori knowledge is also necessarily true. Only a particular kind of knowledge of identities, identity terms. So, take for example the sentence, water is H2O. I'm identifying water as H2O. Now, as an identity statement, this is necessarily true. If I go out on the planet Earth and I look around and I find some water, then it is true. I can also know that I have found some H2O. If I go, say I leave the planet, maybe I go to Mars and I'm drilling core samples or something and I find some frozen water. Well, then I know that I found H2O. It's necessarily true that water is H2O. But we come to know this through experience, not sitting in the armchair independently of thinking things through with no sense experience. Now, probably since time immemorial. Oh, Kara has a question. How are identity statements different from analytic propositions? Well, they're necessarily true, but they're known after sense experience. So somebody has to teach you, like you're in science class back in the day, right? Or maybe you're watching Bill Nye the Science Guy or something. I don't know. That's where I learned about H2O, by the way, back in the day. Um, you're watching Bill Nye, and Bill Nye says, okay, water is H2O. It's two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. Okay, so I've learnt that fact empirically. I haven't worked it out by sitting in the armchair and, like Descartes, meditating, going like, reason tells me that water is H2O. No, 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 no. Somebody went and discovered this. And then they put it in science textbooks and on science television programs, and people learned that water is H2O, right? But that's different than all triangles are three-sided figures, right? That's something that you can know without actually going and looking at different triangles. So, analytic propositions, again, their predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. And this is not true for synthetic propositions. And water is H2O is a synthetic. Well, I mean, it's it's tricky. It's an empirical sort of thing, and an a posteriori kind of thing um, that is necessarily true. Does that answer the question? I hope so. Okay.
No, I'm still confused.
Okay, so remember that an analytic proposition is true by definition because what what it's about, the part of the sentence that says what it's about, triangles, for example, contains um, information about the properties of what it's about. So triangles have three sides. That's necessarily true because we've just defined triangles that way, right? All bachelors are unmarried men is necessarily true because being an unmarried man is the definition of being a bachelor. We've just decided that that's what those words mean. But nobody decided that water was made of H2O. We discovered that water was made of H2O. But we know because we make this identity claim, water is H2O, that every time I go and find some water, I know that it's H2O, a priori. Okay, so I mean, I think I think this can be taught, but it's also something that people realize. Like, I remember back in geometry, right? I learned that there were all kinds of different triangles, like equilateral, isosceles, or a right triangle. And they all have different kinds of internal angles and so forth. But in every case, there's three sides, and the internal angles always sum to what is it, 180 degrees, right? So you once you have these prototypical examples, you kind of can generalize without going and checking every triangle. You're like, oh yeah, I guess if it's got three sides, it's a triangle, right? Um, Kara, go ahead.
Aren't we just generalizing that all water is H2O in the same way? Because we're defining water as H2O.
That's exactly what we're doing. But we're doing it a posteriori because it's an empirical fact, right? Not like triangles, which are definitionally three-sided polygons.
But water is definitionally H2O.
Yes, because we've went and figured that out. Like somebody went out and looked at water and said, "Oh, it turns out water is made up of two hydrogen molecules and an oxygen molecule. So if I go and find something called water, it's got to be H2O."
But if you go and find something, a three-sided polygon, it's got to be a triangle.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
but
how's that different?
the difference is the way we come to know it, right? Knowing that a triangle is a three-sided polygon can be known without sense experience. Knowing that water is made of H2O cannot be known, or at least initially, without sense experience. It had to be discovered. Water could have been made, might have turned out that it's made of something else, right? Um, so Quinn,
Yeah, but isn't by saying that water is H2O, aren't you also just saying that the entire theory of elements and like periodic elements is true when and isn't that like a statement that is much more likely to be false than water is just H2O?
um, I'm not sure if I follow, but
Okay, because by
I mean,
using
we wouldn't, we would say something like the periodic table tells us what things are made out of. That's true, but that's not the same kind of proposition as water is H2O.
H2O, aren't you like at the same time also saying that elements do exist and that there isn't another explanation for the data that we see when we look at like the base properties of things?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, elements exist. Um, but we're just looking at the difference between these two kinds of sentences, right?
Okay.
So remember that one of the things, let's bring it back to this basic idea that um, epistemologists have long regarded uh, that knowledge that you come by in an posteriori manner is not necessarily true because it could have been some other way, right? Things could have been
Yeah.
otherwise. Like the cat is on the mat is a posteriori. Is it true? I don't know. We've got to go see where the cat is. But for an identity statement, like that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about identity statements. Once somebody identifies water as H2O, then I can know necessarily that if I find some water, it's necessarily true that I have some H2O.
Okay.
Kara?
I'm still struggling with, but like we created the definition of H2O as water. So I'm still,
Yeah.
can you try giving a different example? Because I wonder if I'm just getting stuck on this particular example.
Yeah. Okay. So it also works with proper names. So Josh Redstone picks out an individual, namely me, right? So Josh Redstone is your philosophy professor, um, who teaches mind, world, and knowledge. So once I've identified myself, Josh Redstone, as your philosophy instructor in mind, world, and knowledge at Carleton University, then you know if you go to lecture, um, that it's going to be me, who's your professor, unless of course I call in sick or something, right? Um, it's just the case that like okay, if we find and I hate to bring it back to water, but water really is kind of the simple example here because we're going to come back to this later in the textbook when we do the twin Earth thought experiment. But like if I find there's been this liquid stuff flowing around the planet forever, and we call it water. And one day somebody looks at it and figures out what it's made of. It's made of hydrogen and oxygen. So we say water is H2O. Then everybody on the planet knows that when they go and find some water, it's also H2O. It's not going to turn out to be something else. But this is an empirical fact because somebody discovered what water was made of. So I've got to get over to the chat because there's a lot going on in the chat. So let's see. So just going back to no, I mean, the fact that the name of water doesn't indicate what it is made of, is that the difference? Well, yeah, that's right. It's a synthetic proposition, if that's what you mean. Um, it's a special kind of statement, an identity statement. Nicholas, I think you have it right there. We discovered that water was H2O, um, but we defined triangles as three-sided polygons. Yeah. And Abby, I think you have it right here as well. Mm, Ben, you might be right. It's got to be analytic. Well, right now we're dealing with a necessary a posteriori, not an analytic a posteriori. But yeah, like Philippe says, one we discovered, the other we defined. The Earth revolves around the sun is an a posteriori statement. Yes. Yes, that's right. The only thing that is stumping me is that someone one day had to discover the triangle to name it as such. Um, yeah, maybe. But like a rationalist would say, once we acquire that concept, we can know that every triangle we ever encounter is going to be a three-sided polygon. Um, Okay. Jeremiah says, I think it's how you found out the identity of the concept. Yeah. Well, if we had if we only knew water as water, um, we wouldn't have this necessary a posteriori identity statement, right? Okay. So I didn't want to get stuck on that for that long, but yeah, it can be tricky. Um, well, no, look, identity statements are a posteriori. We make them up. But it's empirical, right? So it's pretty Leah says it's pretty much what we discovered being a truth through our senses and research. Yeah. Yes. Sarah, yes, water is H2O is a necessary truth, but even though it's necessary, we know it's necessary and true through the use of observation and science. Yeah. Like water, I mean, we don't know prior to knowing it was H2O. I mean, water could have been made out of anything. Um, we had to go and see what it was made of. But once we know that water is H2O, then I know if I go and find some water, then what I've got is H2O. It's necessarily true that if I find water, I found some H2O. But this is something that had to be discovered, not defined. Yeah. We know a circle is round, which is a priori knowledge, and knowing a tire is, yeah, yeah. Kaya, good example. Well, I don't know. So Amy, the thing about triangles is like you don't really like you do find shapes in nature, but I'm not aware of trying. I mean, maybe certain leaves, I guess. Um, but the triangles that we're talking about are the ones that the Greeks would have been working with in geometry, right? I mean, the Greeks were really into geometry because it allowed them to do a lot of stuff, to map out land and make buildings and so forth, right? So I don't know if they would say they discovered triangles or if they defined them. But a rationalist would say that sure, you're going to acquire some concepts through sense experience, but once you acquire those concepts that figure into your a priori knowledge, then you can know things without further sense experience, right? Are all English words a posteriori? Well, I'm not sure what you mean, Ben. Like we learn them the way we learn them, we come to know them in an a posteriori manner. But what they mean, um, like the meanings of words, like bachelor is an unmarried man. I mean that's a priori, not a posteriori. Um, so yeah, yeah, yeah. Humans invented language. Um, yeah. Okay, so Jeremiah says we know a circle is round. About finding out the concept of pi in a circle is identity statement. So I don't know that a circle is round is an empirical proposition. Um, and pi isn't a concept. I mean, pi is a number. So I think we're getting lost here, if I'm being honest. Yeah, like let's not worry about this anymore. All you need to know is that for centuries, philosophers thought that a priori truths were the necessarily true ones, right? triangles have three sides. Okay, that's necessarily true because we've defined it thusly. We've defined a triangle as a three-sided polygon. So if I go, hey, look, a triangle, you know, oh, that triangle is going to have three sides. It's necessarily true. Water is H2O is also necessarily true. That's that identity statement. That is because we've discovered it and defined it after our discovery. So it's a posteriori. Okay, Amr, yeah, I see what you're saying there. Yeah, that's what Jeremiah was trying to say, I think. Yeah. Yeah, Leah, exactly. And once we've discovered that water is H2O, then we know necessarily that whenever we find some water, we found H2O. It's really that simple. Like it can be hard, it can be easy to overcomplicate this, right? But that is the difference. So, okay, we've got to move on. But questions, you want to continue this discussion? Um, I would do so in the Discord server. That would be a great place to have a discussion like this. Okay, so now let's talk about the traditional analysis of knowledge. Oof, you know what? That conversation left me under caffeinated. I'll be right back. It's time for a little bit of coffee. All right. Now, yeah, exactly. I can hear it in the SpongeBob narrator voice. 10 years later. Um, so what is the traditional analysis of knowledge? Well, this is really nice. In the ugh, in the dialogue Meno, Plato uses the character Socrates and the character Meno to have a conversation about the nature of virtue, which eventually kind of turns into a conversation about the nature of knowledge. And toward the end of the dialogue, um, Socrates and Meno are sort of wondering what the difference between knowledge and true belief is. And Socrates says, look, true beliefs are as useful as knowledge, but knowledge is more secure. And he draws this analogy between true beliefs and the images of Daedalus. So, Daedalus, who knows about Daedalus? The legendary craftsman from ancient Greek lore. Who can tell me a little bit about Daedalus? Yeah. Yeah, he made the labyrinth at Crete where the Minotaur was. He had a son named Icarus. Yeah, that's right. Made those wings for Icarus, and Icarus flew too close to the sun, and the wax that held the feathers on the wings melted, and Icarus fell to his death. That's a story about hubris, arrogance before the gods, right? Yeah, same guy. So he makes all kinds of cool stuff. One of the things he makes is these images, statues, like graven images, right? Um, and it was said that the images of Daedalus were so lifelike, they were so realistic, that if you didn't fasten them down, they would get up and walk away. Um, like they would become animated or something, right? Because they were so lifelike. Well, I'll answer that in just a moment. Um, but Socrates says that they're like that true beliefs are like the images of Daedalus. He says true opinions, beliefs, are a fine thing and do all sorts of good so long as they stay in their place, but they will not stay long. They run away from a man's mind, so they are not worth much until you tether them by working out the reason. So true beliefs need to be tied down or fastened, or they'll run away like Daedalus's images. And so true beliefs need a reason. You need a reason or some justification for your true beliefs to fasten them down, like you fasten down an image of Daedalus, lest it run away on you. So my thoughts about Socrates only existing in Plato's writings. Well, Socrates does not only exist in Plato's writings. Um, so, for example, there are other dialogues that tell of Socrates. Um, one of the very famous Platonic dialogues is the Apology, which is an account of Socrates' defense at his trial. That's what apology means in this context. It comes from apologia, which means defense. So Socrates wasn't saying, "Hey, sorry, I was corrupting the youth, everybody." No, he was saying, "I'm not a sophist. I believe in the gods and I don't corrupt the youth. I don't even take any money for my teachings, etc., etc." Right? There's another account of his apology by another thinker named Xenophon. So there are other philosophers who write about Socrates. And Socrates is also used as a character in some of Aristophanes' comedic plays. So it's very likely that there was a real Socrates, but we don't know, like he didn't write anything down. So there are actually interesting parallels, I think, between Socrates and Jesus of Nazareth, right? Both had followers, but both did not write anything down themselves. It was other people after the fact that wrote them down. So in each case, we have this kind of, picture of each figure from a little while after they died, but we don't really have any firsthand account beyond the sort of, after the fact kind of thing, right? So there's an interesting parallel there. So Socrates does exist outside of just Plato's writings, and there probably was a historical Socrates, but what was he like beyond what we learn in, the sources we have? We don't really know. We can say that Plato's earlier dialogues probably reflect the real Socrates a little more. And Plato's later dialogues are more Plato speaking through Socrates. So, that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Um, so true beliefs are great, but we don't have a reason for them. We need a reason. We need something to tie down our true beliefs, to make them secure so that they count as knowledge. And what Socrates is saying here is regarded by many as the first articulation of the traditional analysis of knowledge. Knowledge is a kind of belief. It's a justified, true belief. So remember, beliefs are mental representations of the world. So they're a sort of a mental picture, if you like, of how the world is. They're trying to represent the way the world is in a way that a map represents the territory or a portrait represents the person that the portrait is of. A belief represents some aspect of the world. And for a belief to count as knowledge, traditionally, it's got to be true. So for A to be true, for my belief in A to be true, A must be the case, right? If I believe that it is raining, my belief is true if it is raining, if and only if it is raining. And note also that this exemplifies a view that we call realism, right? Realism has it that there is an external world. There is an objective reality that exists independently of the mind. So, if it is raining, I believe it is raining is true just in case it is in fact raining out there in the world where I am. And the belief also has to be justified. So it doesn't just have to be true, because otherwise it's merely a true belief. It needs to be justified. I need to have some reason for holding the belief. Maybe I look out my window and I see that it's raining. So I form the belief, oh, it's raining. in Ottawa right now. It's not, in fact, raining in Ottawa. In fact, it's going to be another hot, sunny day, which hey, I'm getting kind of sick of this heat. Um, I wish I could make reality conform to my beliefs. Like I believe it is raining, and then all of a sudden it starts raining. That would be cool. But no, beliefs have to conform to reality, not the other way around. Yeah, that'd be great. Like, I believe it's a little cooler outside now, and then it cools down. People would be fighting over the weather, like trying to outbelieve one another. Um, so on the traditional analysis, you have knowledge of A just in case you have a belief in A is true, and you're justified in believing A. That's the traditional analysis. So, yeah, belief for hire. I'll come and believe things for you. So on the traditional analysis, if you've got a justified true belief, that is necessary and sufficient for having knowledge. You got everything you need to know something. But um if well, I'm sure that a lot of the crypto people believe that. Yeah. If you believe that, I've got some NFTs to sell you. Um so one thing that we've got to keep in mind is that we are talking about a particular kind of knowledge here. We're talking about propositional knowledge. So knowing that, knowledge of the truth of propositions, sentences about the way the world is, right? So I know that Ottawa is a city in Canada. I know it's the capital city of Canada. I know that triangles have three sides. I know that pizza is Italian American food, right? These are propositional, these are examples of propositional knowledge because they're all examples of knowing that. So I know that Ottawa is a city in Canada is a true proposition, right? But that's different from other kinds of knowledge, such as procedural knowledge. Like that's knowing how to do something. So if I know how to use Google Maps to get to Ottawa from elsewhere, then I have procedural knowledge. I know how to draw a triangle on a piece of paper. I know how to make a fairly serviceable pizza. These are all examples of procedural knowledge. And the traditional analysis does not deal with procedural knowledge, it deals with propositional knowledge, which again is knowledge of the truth of propositions, which are sentences about the world that could be true or false. So this first is expressed in Meno over 2,000 years ago, and then was challenged in the 1960s by a philosopher named Edmund Gettier. Gettier published a very influential paper entitled Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? So, in it, he formulates these counterexamples to the justified true belief account or the traditional analysis. In all of these counterexamples, people have justified true beliefs that don't seem to count as knowledge. And we now call these counterexamples Gettier cases. And what he wanted to show was that having a justified true belief, while necessary, is not sufficient for knowledge. And my favorite example has to do with the broken clock, right? We've all heard the saying, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? Let's say I go into the philosophy department where I know that there is, in fact, a broken clock in the seminar room. Now, let's say it's 4:30, and I go into the department at 4:30, and I look at this broken clock, which, unbeknownst to me, just happened to stop at 4:30. So I go in there, I look around. What time is it? No, it's 4:30. So I form the belief that it is 4:30. Now it actually is 4:30. I just happened to look at the clock when the time really was 4:30. So I look at the clock and I see that it reads 4:30. I form this true belief that it's 4:30, and I seem to have some evidence for my belief. Well, the clock reads 4:30. So I form this justified true belief. But is it knowledge? We're kind of hesitant to say that it is, right? Because even though I have some evidence, it's not particularly good evidence. I could have been, I could have been 1 minute later, or 5 minutes later, or an hour later, and looked at the clock and been wrong. I just happened to look at a broken clock which read 4:30 when the time really just happened to be 4:30. I'm kind of like just epistemically lucky in forming my belief what time it is. Um yeah, like it's just lucky. I don't have a good reason for holding that belief. I'm just lucky. Here's another example from Lehrer. So our subject S has good reasons to believe that her coworker, Mrs. Or Ms. Nogot, owns a Ford. So S has seen Miss Nogot driving her Ford, and she's heard testimony from people around the office that Miss Nogot owns a Ford. So she has justification for believing Nogot owns a Ford, and she forms the belief that someone in the office owns a Ford. But it's actually not Mrs. Nogot who has the Ford. It's Miss Havett who has the Ford. So here, S has a justified true belief in P, our proposition. Someone in the office owns a Ford. But it's not really knowledge, is it? It's not knowledge because the proposition isn't really connected, or the belief in the proposition isn't really connected to the truth of the proposition in the right sort of way. Yes, okay, she believes that someone in the office owns a Ford, but that's because of all of this stuff. She's seen Miss Nogot owning a Ford, driving a Ford, etc. But it's actually Miss Havett. So it's true, someone in the office owns a Ford. Um, but here, the belief doesn't seem connected to reality in the right way. Yeah, people like this. Yeah, Nogot doesn't have the Ford, but Havett got the Ford. Um, Leah says, like an example could be seeing something you think is there, but it's actually not. Like it's a statue of that thing or something. Yes. Sorry, a statue of that thing or something, but you had thought it was the actual thing because you've seen it before. Well, that's kind of like what we would call a misperception, right? Um, like, and this happens all the time. You see what seems to be a figure, but it's actually like the figure of a person, but it turns out to be a tree, right? I was watching that program Unsolved Mysteries, and I skip all of the crime ones, and I watch the paranormal ones with my partner. And there's one this season on the Mothman, this giant flying creature, right? And there's this one person who's recounting this tale. I saw the Mothman. She is like taking her garbage out, and she sees these eyes in a tree and hears this noise. And oh my God, it's the Mothman. And I'm just like screaming to myself, like, it's a raccoon. You saw a raccoon. Like, you saw a raccoon in a tree. That's all. Um, so I get mad because they are solved. Like at least the supernatural ones, they are solved. Um, but yeah, like here, our individual went outside, saw a pair of eyes, heard noises, got frightened, um, and said they saw the Mothman. No, you saw a raccoon. I'm sorry, but that's a raccoon. Um, interestingly, the actual original Mothman sighting is probably attributable to sandhill cranes, and not um, an actual flying entity, right? If you don't believe me, just go and find a sandhill crane. They're enormous, and they make really weird noises. If you did not know what you were looking at, it would probably freak you out, right? Um, so that's a misperception of Mothman, right? Or like Leah was saying, thinking mistaking a statue for a person or something. We would say that that's a misperception, right? This isn't quite a misperception. It's a belief that's true, but it's not quite connected to reality in the way that we want it to be connected to it. Let's look at another example from Alvin Goldman, the barn facade example. So there's a film crew that's doing a movie, right, in the country, and they've set up a number of barn facades. So fake barns that look like a barn if you're driving by, but if you went up to it, you would see it's just a wall, a barn-shaped wall, right, that's painted to look like a barn. Now, there's a father who likes to bring his son on a Sunday drive, passing, drive through the countryside. You go on it. Sometimes you're bored, you go on a drive, you see the sights. So he takes his son up this road. They're passing real barns and they're passing fake barns, and he happens to point to a real barn. Look, son, that's a barn. Oh, wow. I maybe this kid's really into barns. I don't know. The point is, father points at what happens to be a real barn. Does he know it's a barn? Well, Goldman says maybe he does, but he could have just as easily pointed to a facade and said that that's a barn, and he would have been wrong. So again, the father is kind of like epistemically lucky in forming this belief, as is the son, right? He's right as long as his belief is about an actual barn, but remember, he just as easily could have pointed to a facade. So again, Gettier cases are cases where we have a true belief, which is justified, but the justification uh, is not quite adequate, or rather, the evidence that we have isn't connected to the truth of our belief in the right way. And what all of this is meant to show is that to have knowledge, you need a justified true belief. Justified true belief is necessary for knowledge, but not all justified true beliefs will count as instances of knowledge. So justified true belief is necessary, but not sufficient for knowledge. Crumley says the traditional analysis leaves open the possibility that a person's reasons or justification might not be appropriately connected to what it is that makes the belief true. So maybe the traditional analysis is not strong enough. It might be too weak to give us an account of what knowledge really is. That's the thing about Gettier cases, right? If things had been just a little different, we would turn out to have adopted a false belief rather than a true one. If the father had pointed a little bit over to the left at a facade instead of a real barn, we wouldn't say he had knowledge, right? If I'd arrived at the office and looked at the clock later when it was obvious that the clock was broken, I wouldn't have knowledge. We don't usually think that we should be lucky in our knowledge. Knowledge should not be achieved by luck. It should be achieved by reason. So what do we do? Right? Like, when people say in retrospect, I knew it, did they? Or were they just lucky? Let's try and think of an example. What's an example of somewhere where you had a suspicion of something that later turned out to be true? So you had a suspicion of something, um, but you didn't have evidence, and then later it turned out to be true, and you said, I knew it. Yeah, like hindsight bias. Oh, no, no, actually, Kaya, I think that's a good example. When you have, yeah, like say, okay, yeah, like, so let's say like Kaya and Karen here, like that you've got a bad feeling about somebody, and then it turns out the person really is bad and you say, I knew it, right? You didn't really know it. You were correct, but it was more like a lucky guess, right? Yeah. Well, I don't know. Abasi, like, well, maybe that's more like you have trouble recollecting whether your mom asked you to take the meat out of the freezer, like, and you can't quite remember because maybe there are a couple days where she did and a couple days where she didn't, and you can't remember if she did that today, right? And then oh, what, imagine you take the meat out and leave it out, and you didn't need to take it out. Oh no, like you don't want to ruin the meat, right? But always thaw your meat safely. Um Yeah, but again, that's like that's the hindsight bias that I think it was Shania who mentioned. That's a sort of like a heuristic that you're employing. It's a mental shortcut. It's not knowledge. It's like an intuition. And intuitions can be reliable, but they're not necessarily reliable, right? Yeah, sports outcomes. That's a good example. Like I knew that my favorite team would win. Did you? No, no, you didn't. I mean, yeah, yeah, unjustified guesses like mystery box storytelling, like when you're watching a show and it's like what's up with this character and everybody forms a fan theory and then maybe a lot of those theories turn out to be false, but one turns out to be true. Maybe your theory is true and you're like, "Yes, I knew it." You didn't really know it. You had a lucky guess, right? Yeah, gambling too. Yeah, all very good examples, right? Okay, so we all agree knowledge should not be achieved by luck. Sometimes you have a gut feeling or an intuition that turns out to be correct, and that's because intuition is kind of like a cognitive shortcut. It's supposed to save us time. It's like a rapid unconscious judgment that's supposed to save us time because thinking through things slowly and deliberatively is costly, right? In terms of time, in terms of cognitive resources. So that's why we've evolved to have these kind of gut reactions, right? Um, and a lot of times they might turn out to be right. They just don't meet the criteria to count as knowledge. Yeah, like hints and evidence. I don't know, maybe. I'll be honest, my example for this is so when the Avengers are fighting Thanos and Captain America lifts Thor's hammer and Thor's all like, "I knew it." Like, "I knew you could lift my hammer." Um, you know, there's a little bit of a hint there. Because earlier, like Steve Rogers goes to pick up the hammer and it looks like it kind of moves, but he's just like, nah, I can't pick that up. Um, but then when he does, Thor's like, "Oh, I knew it." Um, yeah, I'm actually not that into the Marvel movies, but I do like the stuff that the Russo brothers directed and Endgame and was one of those. So yeah, that was a moment that well everybody in the theater was like when that happened, right? So yeah, it was fun. I mean, movies are supposed to be fun, right? So in that case, there's a kind of a hint and then there's a little bit of evidence, right? Yeah. Well, that's why he was worthy, right? It's like I can move it, but I'm not gonna. I'm so worthy, I'm not gonna show off how worthy I am, right? That's how worthy Steve Rogers was. Um yeah, Leah, yeah, I guess if you haven't seen well, it depends what order you've watched them in, right? Like if you haven't seen episodes 4, 5, and 6, then you're like, oh yeah, it seems like Anakin's gonna take a turn for the worse here. But like, because I'm older, the I saw 4, 5, and 6 when I was a little kid. Oh yeah, if you're going chronologically and if you've never seen them before, right? That's right. Yeah, Darth Vader means dark father. Yeah, Vader is the Dutch word for father. That's right. So dark father. He's meant to be kind of like this Jungian shadow figure, right? Um yeah. Well, Star Wars is interesting because it's kind of a collection of it's a lot of different stuff. It's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Um there's a lot of like samurai movie stuff and a lot of World War II movie stuff. Like in A New Hope, when they're doing the Death Star trench run, that's copy pasted right out of the Dam Busters, which is an old World War II film where they have to blow up a dam by getting this bouncing bomb in this very precise, it like skips along the water like a stone and has to like go into this thing so they can blow up this dam. It's just like the Death Star trench run. Even the dialogue. And yeah, Akira Kurosawa, like um the Hidden Castle, the characters, there's a couple characters in the Hidden Castle that are always there kind of witnessing the story unfolding, and that's R2D2 and C3PO, right? And yeah, the Jedi are just samurai in space. So yeah. Oh, and the whole desert planet is ripped off from Dune, right? So yeah, I mean George Lucas kind of copies and pastes a lot of different stuff together to make this big giant thing that is Star Wars, right? Okay, this is maybe the last slide we'll have time for. Um, maybe what Gettier cases do is they expose defective justifications. So our justification isn't is we have some justification, it's just not good enough, right? Yeah, okay, like I am a pretty big geek, right? So I will try and use geeky references to make things more concrete. Like identity statements, right? Water is H2O is an identity statement that you discover that's an a priori thing that is necessarily true. So is Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker. That's an identity statement that you know after the fact. It's a posteriori, but it's necessarily true that if you see Darth Vader, you're like, "Oh, Anakin Skywalker," right? Or Batman, Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent, Superman, Walter White, Heisenberg, identity statements, right? So, maybe Gettier cases expose defective justifications. We have justifications, they're just not good enough because there's some bit of evidence or information that we're just not aware of yet. So, if you became aware of this, what we'll call a Gettier fact, then you would change your beliefs. Now, we call propositions that express such facts defeaters. Like, think back to my um, broken clock case. I go into the office, it's 4:30 in the afternoon. I look at a broken clock that just happens to read 4:30, and I say, "Oh, it's 4:30. Good." Someone passes by and says, "Oh, that clock is broken. It really is 4:30, but the clock is broken." Then I would have access to a defeater, right? I would know about a defeater. A defeater, Crumley says, provides some reason for thinking that one or more of the justifying beliefs or assumptions is mistaken. And this leads us to what we call the indefeasibility view of knowledge. So a true belief, according to this view, counts as knowledge if and only if it is indefeasibly justified. So there are no true propositions that could undermine your belief or undermine your justification for the belief. There are no true sentences that could undermine the justification you have for holding the belief that you do. Are there any defeaters that we could think of for the Gettier cases we looked at a moment ago? Well, let's think of the no got have it case, right? I believe that someone in the office owns a Ford because I've seen Miss No Got driving one. But maybe someone says, "Hey, have you seen Miss Havett's new Ford?" And I go, oh, it's Miss Havett who has the Ford. Okay. Well, I guess I knew that someone had a Ford, but I thought it was Miss Nogot, but it's actually Miss Havett, right? So that's a defeater. If someone said to me, "Hey, did you see Miss Havett's new Ford?" Right? This sort of illustrates that knowledge is supposed to be extendable. That is that if we really have knowledge, then new information shouldn't weaken the justification that we have for our beliefs. If indeed it is true that those beliefs are true and indefeasibly justified as well. So, if you really have knowledge, then new information shouldn't weaken your justification. It should support your justification. Yeah, no, no, no. I mean, that's a good example. Like, if he maybe somebody tells him before he goes on his drive, like, hey, they're filming that movie over there, a movie about, I don't know, Barnes. Um, I'm it's hard to think of a movie in which Barnes feature. Oh, maybe they're filming that new Twister movie over there, and they need a lot of but yeah, Barnyard. Um, what happens in the barnyard? I don't know. Well, let's assume that's Cormac. That's a good point. Let's assume it's reliable testimony. So, maybe there's a poster that the movie company put up, just like, "Hey, we're filming Barnyard 2 Electric Boogaloo, and there's going to be fake barns, so if you're taking your son on a drive to show him barns, just keep in mind some of the barns are fake." This is a very, this example is a bit silly, but that means that you know, I've got some new information actually in the form of a potential defeater for the belief about barns and which are barns and which are facades, which changes my beliefs relationship with the way the world is, and ought to strengthen my justification and not weaken it, right? What about, yeah, that's a good question. What about those signs? Well, I guess there's actually been a debate about this for quite a long time, right? Um, and it went back and forth, right? Like Isaac Newton, I believe it was Isaac Newton, thought that light behaved like a particle, and his contemporary Christian Huygens, I think is how you say it in Dutch, thought that light behaved like a wave. And Einstein famously developed theory where he explained the law of the photoelectric effect, where he employed the notion that light is a particle. And then, but he also helped initiate quantum physics, which is where you get like the double slit experiment, where you can see that light works as a wave, like it's either or, right? Um, like you say. So I guess it depends on which scientist believed what. Um, if you believe light is either a wave or a particle, you're wrong, right? Because it can be both. Um, so I guess if you exclusively believe one or the other, then you have a false belief. Um, yeah, when you see fake animals, yeah. Well, that's like the barn facade, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, hey, Christian Huygens was Huygens or I don't speak Dutch, okay, but I know that the letter G in Dutch is like a sound. So I assume it's Huygens, not Huygens or something like that. I'm just trying not to get it wrong, but I probably am. See, this is a perfect example. I don't know how to pronounce that name. New information. I might believe it's, yeah, Huygens, right? Or Huygens, I don't know, right? If I believe it's Huygens, then new information shouldn't weaken my justification for believing that's how to pronounce it. But new information is probably going to reveal that I am absolutely butchering that name, right? So there you go. Wow, okay, that's the end. Um, that's all we have time for. So we're gonna have to leave off on this slide. We'll pick that up next week. We'll quickly finish this. Because we just have a few more things to talk about. We're going to talk about the no false premise view and reliabilism. And yeah, we have Norman the reliable clairvoyant, which is a fun little thought experiment that we'll do. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Nomin. Yeah, I am throwing a lot of information at you, but I will try and make it like a little more entertaining with the geeky references, just so that a lot of this probably seems unfamiliar, but if we can make it familiar with examples, it helps. It helps, right? So I'll try and keep doing that. But thanks, everyone. Good lecture. And I'll see you all next week, where we'll finish off this stuff and then we'll move on to theories of justification. All right. Take care. Have a good weekend. Bye for now.